The first thing that we're going to talk about today are two new JavaScript variable types. Two new variable types. And those variable types are going to be arrays and objects. Arrays and objects. Now, before we dive into arrays, I want you to recall some of the stuff that we worked on or introduced last week, namely strings. Remember, a string is anything wrapped in quotes, just like that. It's my name. And strings have unique properties like length. I can access the length of this string by typing in the string and following it with .length. And it returns a numeric value indicating the number of characters contained in that array, in that string, the number of characters contained in that string. I can also do that by storing a string in a variable. This is a string. And then I can access the length of that string by using the variable name, myString.length. 16 characters. 16 characters, and that's including spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 characters in total in the string. That's how .length works. .length on a string. We also talked about how you can access individual characters in a string. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it looked something like this. I type in the string, followed by square brackets, and a number. And that will return a character in the string. Now the number in those square brackets, if you don't remember, is an index. It's an index indicating the position of a character in a string. So for example, the 0 index is always going to be the very first letter in a string, the very first character in a string. If I change this to Evan at the 1 index, it should return the V. At the 2 index, the A. At the 3 index, the N, etc., etc., etc. If we had a really long string, we could have my string at the 101st index. Doesn't matter. If there's a character there, it will be returned. Okay? So that's how we can access individual characters in a string. Well, an array actually behaves exactly the same way. So let's talk about what an array is. An array is really just a list of items. I'm going to create my array here, and we declare or indicate an array with square brackets. Currently, this is an empty array. This is a completely valid line of code. I can just set up an array and leave it empty if I want. But I'm going to put some data types in here. I'm going to put in a number, 406. I'm going to put in a string. I'm going to put in a Boolean. And that'll do for now. Let's leave it at that. 3 items in this array. 3 items in this array. 1 number, 1 string, and 1 Boolean. Keep in mind, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that an array can contain any type of JavaScript data type. Any JavaScript data type. It's got a number, it's got a Boolean, it's got a string. It can even contain other arrays, and I'll show you what that'll look like in a minute. But an array can contain any other data type at all in JavaScript, and it will be contained in an array as a list. Now let's save that, reload my page, and let's check the variable myArray. Okay, that looks good. It's returning the correct value for that variable, an array containing 3 items. Now let's test out some of these string properties on this array and see if they work. Can we find the length of the array using .length? Yes, we can. That returns the length of the array, which in this case is the number of items contained in the array. 1, 2, 3. The number of items contained in the array. That is how you access the length of an array, and that's very important. We will be doing that a lot. Okay, now can we access individual items in an array, much like we accessed individual characters in a string? Well, if I type in my array at the 0 index, it returns 406, the very first item in the array. Let's see my array at the 1 index. I get a string, the second item in the array. My array at the 2nd index, I get false, the boolean, the third item in the array. So arrays in this manner behave very much like strings. They have a length property, telling you how many things they contain. They have indexes, allowing us to access individual items inside these arrays. 406, a string, false. And we're going to be using both of these things to manipulate arrays and loop through arrays quite a bit. Okay. Now, it's important to understand what's happening when you access, oh, sorry, it's my array, not my string. When you access an item in an array like this using an index. Okay? When I type in my array, square bracket 1, square bracket, this actually has the value of a string. A string. This, to the browser, is equal to a string. They're the exact same thing. I might as well have typed in a string, just like that. Okay, now what's important here is you can continue to manipulate or affect a string by using my array at the 1 index to reference it. For example, my array.length, we already tested out, returns 3, right? But my array at the 1 index.length returns 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The number of characters in a string. My array 1 at the 0 index returns a, the first character in a string. Okay, if this is confusing, that's okay. But what we're actually doing is accessing the item or character at the very first index of this. And remember, this is a string. What's important here is to understand that the JavaScript engine is going to evaluate your code one piece at a time. This is not any more complicated to the browser's eyes as a string at the 0 index. It's the exact same thing. It's identical. That's all that means. The browser evaluates this. It finds the item at the first index, or the second item in the array, and then it finds the character at the first index of that item. Okay? We're going to get some more practice with that later on, but I just wanted to make you aware of it and understand that you can continue to manipulate items like this. So if you needed to access this false and set it to true, well, I could probably do that. I could say my array at the second index. Let me just call it first. It's false. But what happens now if I set it to true? Well, did it change? Let me look at the entire array. And yes, that boolean has actually been changed to true. So there are ways in which you can manipulate arrays just like you can manipulate strings in addition to accessing individual items inside them. But that's an array. The core is it's a list. It's a list of items. It's a list of data types. It has a length property, and you can access individual items in the array using the same index principle that we used on strings. Don't let arrays intimidate you. They're just lists. Now before I said I'd show you what an array containing arrays might look like. Well, let's I'll call this one combined array, and this is going to contain, let's say, an array of numbers and an array of strings and an array of booleans. That's probably good. 3 arrays. An array which contains 3 arrays. Now, the question is, what's the length of this array? Well, let's check. I'm going to console.log combined array.length. And then, just to drive the point home, I'm going to console.log combined array at the 0 index. I'm going to console.log combined array at the 1 index and combined array at the 2 index. Okay, so the length is 3. The combined array at the 0 index, the first item in the array is an array of numbers. The second item in the array is an array of strings. The third item in the array is an array of booleans. Now we could, of course, take this a step further. What happens if I want to log all of the first items of those arrays within arrays? Well, just need to add square bracket 0 to the ends of these. Okay, so we get 1, the first item in the first item in combined array. We get A, the first item in the second item in combined array. And we get true, the first item in the third item in combined array. All right, so that's indexes, that's length, that's arrays. The next variable type that we need to talk about are objects. Objects. Now, objects, it's easy to think that objects are similar to arrays in that they also contain multiple data types. They also contain multiple data types, but they're not the same in any way. They're not a list. They don't have a length. They don't have indexes. Okay, an object is really a more complex way of storing multiple data properties about a single item. So for example, I'm going to make an Evan variable. This is an object. This is going to be an object indicated by curly braces. This is an empty object. But var Evan is going to be an object which has 3 properties. 3 properties. The first property is going to be name. And the name property of the Evan object is going to contain a string, which is my name. Then there's going to be an age property. Keep in mind, please, that I'm making up these properties as I go along. They're kind of like variables within this object. Okay, I'm making them up, and I'm assigning value to them. These terms, name and age, they're not coming from anywhere special. They're not magic terms pre-coded into the JavaScript engine. Name could be elephant, and it would still work in more ways than one. Anyway, age. The age is going to have a value of February 6th is 28. I forget how old I am every year. It is. It contains a numeric value as opposed to name, which contains a string value. 2 different data types in 2 different properties. And then we'll have, how about a gender property, which will also contain a string. Actually, no, let's instead of a gender property, let's have an is female property and have it set to false, indicating that I am not female. Okay, so we have a string, a number, and a boolean. Multiple different data types contained in a single object. So in this way, objects can be mistaken for being similar to arrays, but they are really not. They are quite different. Okay? Now when an object is being created, every property needs to have a unique name, a unique identifier. Like name, I can't have 3 different names here. They will overwrite each other, or it will be very difficult to access the different values. Each property name must have a unique name. And each property must have a value of some kind. It must have a value of some kind. Now it can be an empty string, or it can be null. Remember, null means nothing. Or it can be false, obviously, but it must have some kind of value. It can be an empty string, or an empty array, or null, or false. But there must be a value for each property inside your object. Okay, so we have properties, values. Properties, sometimes also known as keys, and values. Property value pairs, key value pairs. Each property and value pair is separated by a comma. All property value pairs are contained within curly braces. The very last property and value in an object is not followed by a comma. If I put a comma there, it will throw an error. Okay, so commas will separate your properties, but you're not going to just put a comma after every property just because. Okay, so this is the Evan object. I'm going to save that, reload my page, and open my console. And we're going to check this variable which I just created. Remember, always check your variables. I'm going to type in Evan, and it shows me the full object. Name Evan, age 28, is female, false. Okay, so I can access the Evan object whenever I want. The next question is, how do I access individual properties and their values in that object? Well, we've come full circle right back to dot notation. This is where dot notation actually comes from. So if I wanted to access the name, the value of the name property of this object, I would type in the name of the variable dot name, and it returns Evan. Evan dot age will return 28. Evan dot is female will return false. As simple as that. Okay? The name of the variable, let me change the name of this variable so we're not confused. I'm just going to make it person. Okay, so now person is our object. Person.name is Evan. Person.age is 28. Person.is female is false. This is how we access the values of properties in an object. This is a full object with 3 properties. Now what happens if I try to access is male? I get undefined because that property has not been defined. It does not exist. It does not exist. There is no is male property. But I could give is male a value, and now when I call the person object, it actually contains a new property, is male, set to true. Now we're not going to use that very much at all. In fact, I don't think we're going to use it at all, but I want you to be aware that until you define and set a value for a property, it will be undefined. So if you try to call a property that has not been defined in an object, you will return undefined. However, you can create a new property and assign it a value on the fly. That's just a fun thing to know. Okay, arrays and objects. Those are the 2 new variable data types that we learned so far. So now, all of the variable types that we're dealing with are going to be strings, booleans, numbers, arrays, and objects. Okay, last week we did discuss null and undefined very briefly. Those are primitive data types. These are going to be our 5 variable data types: strings, booleans, numbers, arrays, objects.